Welcome to David's Stories. Today we follow Eldon Mills, a humble judge mocked by his daughter's fiancé Martin for his modest suit. Through patience and wisdom, Eldon exposes Martin's arrogance at the wedding, delivering a powerful lesson in respect and character. Subscribe and hit the bell for weekly videos uncovering truths. Share your thoughts below. Let's start the story. The air in Beverly Hills carried a faint shimmer, as if the city itself exhaled wealth and secrets. I stepped out of my car, a reliable but unremarkable sedan parked on the curb of my daughter Kristen's sprawling estate. The house loomed ahead, a glass and marble monolith, glowing under the twilight sky, its manicured lawns and sculpted hedges whispering of a world I'd never sought to join. My navy wool suit, purchased for $100 at a department store 2 years ago, clung to me like an old friend, simple, dependable, a quiet rebellion against the opulence around me. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, an introduction to the man my daughter had chosen to marry. But as I adjusted my tie and walked toward the front door, a prickle of unease stirred in my chest, like the faint hum of a storm gathering on the horizon. Kristen greeted me at the entrance, her smile radiant but tinged with nervous energy. Her auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her emerald dress caught the light like liquid starshine. "Dad, you made it," she said, pulling me into a hug. Her warmth grounded me, a reminder of the life we'd built together after Margaret's passing. Quiet evenings, shared laughter, and the unspoken bond of a father and daughter navigating loss. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, kissing her forehead. "Wouldn't miss it." She led me inside, her heels clicking on the marble floor. The foyer opened into a dining room that felt more like a museum than a home. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across a mahogany table, set with porcelain so fine it seemed to hum with its own elegance. The air smelled of rosemary and roasted lamb, but beneath it lingered something sharper, tension perhaps, or the weight of unspoken expectations. At the head of the table stood Martin Hargrove, Kristen's fiancé. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with a polished charm that bordered on theatrical. His tailored suit, undoubtedly worth more than my car, gleamed under the chandelier's glow, and his dark hair was slicked back with the precision of a man who controlled every detail of his image. His eyes, sharp and assessing, locked onto me as I entered, and for a moment I felt like a case file laid bare on my courtroom bench, scrutinized for flaws. "Eldon, welcome," Martin said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, calculated, the handshake of a man who saw every interaction as a transaction. "Kristen's told me so much about you." "Likewise," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. 30 years as a judge had taught me to read people before they spoke, micro-expressions, shifts in posture, the cadence of a voice. Martin's smile didn't reach his eyes, and his shoulders carried the subtle tension of someone guarding a secret. We sat, Kristen fussing over the table settings, while Martin poured wine from a bottle that probably cost more than my suit. The conversation began, politely enough, small talk about Kristen's marketing career, the wedding plans, the weather in Los Angeles. But as the first course arrived, a delicate salad drizzled with some exotic vinaigrette, Martin's demeanor shifted. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wineglass with a casual arrogance that set my nerves on edge. "So, Eldon," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something sharper, "where did you find that suit? A thrift store, clearance rack, perhaps?" The words landed like a gavel, sharp and deliberate. Kristen froze a serving spoon, hovering over a dish, her eyes darting between us. I set my fork down, the clink against porcelain, louder than it should have been. The room seemed to contract, the chandelier's light turning harsh against my skin. "It's a department store purchase," I said, my voice steady despite the heat rising in my chest. "Served me well for years." Martin laughed, a sound like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "Years, you say? Well, I suppose it's quaint. But for a wedding, our wedding people expect a certain standard. You know photos last forever." Kristen's voice cut through, sharp and strained. "Martin, please. Dad's suit is fine." "Fine." Martin waved her off, his wineglass tilting dangerously close to spilling. "Sweetheart, I'm just being honest. Presentation matters in our world. Venture capitalists, tech moguls, old money families, they notice these things. Your father seems like a decent man, but his gaze swept over me cold and appraising, as if I were a piece of furniture that didn't match the decor. Let's just say appearances tell a story. The words stung not because they wounded my pride, but because they revealed something about the man my daughter had chosen. In my 3 decades on the bench, I'd seen arrogance in every form, defendants who thought wealth or charm could bend justice, lawyers who mistook privilege for invincibility. Martin's tone carried that same entitled cadence, but there was something else beneath it, a flicker of unease, as if he were performing for an audience I couldn't see. "Appearances can be deceiving," I said, meeting his gaze. "I've always found character tells a truer story." Martin's smile tightened, his eyes glittering with something that might have been amusement or challenge. "Character's all well and good, but in our circle, first impressions are currency. You understand, don't you? You work in—" "What was it?" Kristen said. "Some government job." "You're a clerk, I believe." The assumption landed like a physical blow. Kristen had kept my profession a secret at my request. Too many years of people treating judges differently had taught me the value of anonymity. But Martin's casual dismissal, his assumption that I was some low-level bureaucrat, revealed a deeper prejudice. To him I was a relic, a man of modest means who didn't belong in his polished world. "Something like that," I replied, my voice calm but edged with steel. In my courtroom I'd faced men whose arrogance paled in comparison to Martin's men who learned too late that words carried consequences. Kristen set a dish down with more force than necessary, the porcelain clinking against the table. "Martin, can we please just enjoy dinner? Dad's here to celebrate, not to be critiqued." "I'm not critiquing," Martin said, his tone patronizing, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "I'm offering perspective. Not everyone can afford quality tailoring, Eldon. I get it. Government salaries aren't exactly generous." He gestured around the dining room at the expensive artwork and crystal stemware. "This is what success looks like. Maybe I can offer some investment advice, help you build something for retirement." The word retirement hung in the air like smoke, thick with condescension. Kristen's face paled, her hands twisting together in her lap. I saw the flicker of embarrassment in her eyes, the same look I'd seen in defendants' families when their loved ones' flaws were laid bare. But there was something else in her expression, uncertainty perhaps, or the first crack in her perception of the man she loved. "That's generous of you," I said, my voice low, deliberate. "But I've managed my finances well enough." Martin leaned forward, emboldened by his second glass of wine. "Oh, I'm sure you have. But let's be real, Eldon. Weddings like ours come with expectations. Standards. I'll handle the expenses, all of them." He reached across the table and patted my hand, a gesture so condescending it made my jaw tighten. "No need to strain your budget trying to keep up. Think of it as my gift to Kristen, ensuring her day isn't compromised." The dining room fell silent save for the soft tick of an antique clock on the mantel. Kristen's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her carefully planned evening crumbling under the weight of Martin's words. I felt something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest, not anger, not yet, but a recognition, the same instinct I'd honed over years of watching defendants reveal their true natures under pressure. Martin wasn't just arrogant. He was calculating his insults, a performance designed to assert dominance. "Martin," Kristen said, her voice trembling but firm, "I think you should go." He blinked, his wine-addled brain struggling to process her words. "What, sweetheart, we haven't even now." The single word carried the authority of a gavel cutting through his haze. I watched as Martin's face cycled through confusion, indignation, and finally a petulant acceptance that reminded me of defendants who never understood why their actions had consequences. He pushed back from the table, his movements deliberate, as if proving his sobriety through exaggerated care. "Fine, fine," he said, grabbing his jacket from a nearby chair. "But honestly, Kristen, someone had to address the elephant in the room. These differences matter. He swayed slightly, his polished facade cracking under the weight of his own hubris. Kristen followed him to the door, their voices fading into sharp whispers. I caught fragments, his defensive justifications, her embarrassed apologies. The front door closed with a definitive click, leaving the house in sudden quiet. I sat alone at the table, the remnants of dinner cooling in their dishes, the chandelier casting long shadows across the room. When Kristen returned, her shoulders sagged. The confident marketing director replaced by a daughter caught between worlds she couldn't fully reconcile. She sank into her chair, her fingers fidgeting with her engagement ring, the diamond catching the light like a trapped star. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Martin isn't usually like this. The wine, the stress from work, it brings out his worst." I watched her, noting the familiar gesture of touching her ring, a nervous habit I'd seen in my courtroom from spouses defending the indefensible. "Kristen," I said, waiting until she met my eyes. "Did you ever tell him about my work?" Her brow furrowed. "Your work?" "No, of course not. You asked me years ago to keep it quiet after Aunt Clara tried to get you to fix her parking tickets." A faint smile touched her lips at the memory, but it faded quickly. "I told him you work for the state, some administrative role." He didn't ask for details. Of course he hadn't. Martin's world operated on simple hierarchies. Wealth at the top, everything else relegated to irrelevance. A government clerk was barely a blip in his social taxonomy. But there was something in Kristen's tone, a hesitation that hinted at deeper doubts. I leaned forward, my voice soft but firm. "Are you sure this is the man you want to marry?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "Dad, I love him. He's from a different world, that's all. Competitive, status-driven. Sometimes he forgets not everyone thinks that way." I squeezed her hand gently, feeling the familiar weight of parental protection. "Love is a powerful thing, Kristen, but it shouldn't blind you to who someone is when the mask slips." She nodded, her eyes glistening again, but she didn't respond. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths. I stood gathering my jacket and keys and noticed her watching me with the same careful attention she'd shown as a child, trying to read my mood through every subtle cue. "Drive carefully," she said as she walked me to the door. "Always do," I replied, kissing her forehead. I stepped into the Beverly Hills night where perfect lawns stretched under perfect streetlights, everything manicured and controlled. My car sat at the curb, a modest interruption in the luxury landscape, much like me. The drive back to Pasadena took me through the heart of Los Angeles, past the glittering towers of Century City, and into neighborhoods where real lives unfolded unburdened by the pretense of wealth. The headlights and taillights formed rivers of light in my rearview mirror, a hypnotic flow that matched the rhythm of my thoughts. Martin Hargrove wasn't just a man who'd insulted me. He was a puzzle, a case study in entitlement, and something about his behavior felt off. Too deliberate, too performative, as if he were testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses. In my 30 years on the bench, I'd seen every shade of human character. Desperate thieves, calculating fraudsters, remorseful sinners, and pathologically entitled elites. Martin displayed the hallmarks of the latter. The casual cruelty masked as honesty. The inability to consider others' feelings, the assumption that wealth granted moral authority. But there was something else, a shadow behind his polished exterior. A hint of something darker I couldn't yet name. As I pulled into my driveway in Pasadena, the tree-lined streets felt like a sanctuary after Beverly Hills's pristine intimidation. My house was small, well-maintained, unpretentious, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a study lined with law books and family photographs. Margaret's roses still bloomed by the front porch, their scent carrying memories of Saturday mornings spent in quiet companionship. Inside, I moved through my evening routine jacket, hung in the closet, keys on the kitchen counter. A glass of water from the tap, no crystal stemware needed. In my study, surrounded by volumes of legal precedents and judicial opinions, I sat in my leather recliner and let the evening's events settle over me like dust. Kristen loved Martin had accepted his proposal, planned a future with him. Those were facts immutable for now. But facts could evolve, and people revealed themselves over time, often in ways they couldn't predict. Martin's insults weren't the real issue. They were symptoms of a deeper flaw, a worldview that saw people like me and perhaps Kristen as lesser to be managed or improved upon. His offer to pay for the wedding wasn't generosity. It was control, a power play wrapped in benevolence. I'd seen it before in courtrooms in defendants who thought money could buy absolution. But there was something else gnawing at me, a question I couldn't shake. Why had Martin been so fixated on my suit, so determined to humiliate me? It felt personal, almost rehearsed, as if he were playing a role in a larger script. In my years on the bench, I'd learned to trust my instincts when something felt off, when the evidence didn't quite align with the story presented. Martin Hargrove was hiding something, I was sure of it. I opened a drawer in my desk and pulled out a small notebook, a habit from my early days as a judge. I jotted down the evening's details, Martin's words, his gestures, the flicker of unease in his eyes, when Kristen challenged him. Evidence, I reminded myself, always started small, a single thread that could unravel a larger tapestry. I closed the notebook and leaned back, the chair creaking under my weight. Outside Los Angeles thrummed with restless energy, a city of dreams and deceptions. In courtrooms across the city, judges were preparing for tomorrow's cases, weighing evidence, seeking truth. I was no different, though my courtroom tonight had been a dining room, and my defendant was a man who didn't yet know he'd been judged. The wedding was a month away. 30 days for Martin to reveal more of himself, for the threads of his character to come into focus. 30 days for me to decide how to protect my daughter from a man whose mask was already slipping. I closed my eyes, letting the day's tension drain away, but the prickle of unease remained, a whisper of mystery that promised more revelations to come. The Pasadena morning unfolded in a gentle haze. Sunlight filtering through the rose bushes Margaret had planted decades ago, their petals trembling in the breeze. My house, modest and unassuming, stood as a quiet counterpoint to the glittering excess of Beverly Hills. Inside, the scent of coffee mingled with the faint must of old law books lining my study. I sat at the kitchen counter, newspaper open to the local politics section, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the previous night's dinner. Martin Hargrove's words, sharp, calculated, dripping with condescension, echoed like a poorly delivered closing argument. His mockery of my $100 suit, his assumption that I was a lowly clerk, his patronizing offer to pay for Kristen's wedding, they weren't just insults. They were clues, fragments of a puzzle I hadn't yet solved. The phone's shrill ring sliced through the quiet, startling me mid-sip. I glanced at the clock, 10:30 a.m., an odd time for social calls. Setting my coffee down, I reached for the receiver, the cool plastic grounding me as I braced for whatever was coming. "Hello," I said, my voice steady, judicial. "Eldon, it's Martin." His voice carried a rough edge, the remnants of last night's wine clinging to his vowels. "Listen, I need to apologize for last evening. I had too much to drink, and I said some things that were inappropriate." I leaned back in my chair, surrounded by the familiar weight of my study shelves of legal precedents, a framed photograph of Margaret and Kristen on the desk, a leather recliner worn from years of late-night case reviews. Martin's apology sounded rehearsed, a performance delivered to clear his conscience for whatever came next. In my 30 years on the bench, I'd heard countless apologies, some genuine, most not. This one fell firmly in the latter camp. "It's all right, Martin," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "These things happen." Relief flooded his voice, too quick, too eager. "Thank you for being so gracious about it. Kristen was quite upset after you left. She made it clear I crossed some lines." I glanced out the window where a neighbor's cat prowled through the roses, its movements deliberate, predatory. "She's protective," I said. "Always has been." "Yes? Well, that's actually why I'm calling." Martin's tone shifted, gaining confidence, as if the apology had cleared the way for his real agenda. "I've been thinking about the whole situation, and while I regret my delivery last night, the underlying concern remains valid. Something cold settled in my stomach, a familiar instinct honed from decades of spotting lies in courtrooms. Which concern is that? The suit Eldon. His voice took on a patient, almost patronizing edge, as if explaining an obvious truth to a slow student. Look, I know I was harsh, but there will be elite guests at this wedding. Tech executives, venture capitalists, old California families. First impressions matter enormously in these circles. The cat outside froze its eyes locked on something unseen in the grass. I felt a similar stillness settle over me, my senses sharpening. It's a perfectly respectable suit, Martin. But that's just it. He interrupted, his tone warming with the enthusiasm of someone solving a problem for a lesser being. Respectable isn't the standard we're aiming for. This is a $200,000 wedding. The photography alone costs more than most people make in months. Every detail has to be perfect. The number 200,000 hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with implications about values and priorities. My modest home with its worn furniture and family photographs felt like a different universe entirely. I pictured the wedding invitation Kristen had sent, heavy cardstock, embossed with gold, a tactile announcement of extravagance. Martin's world was one of price tags and appearances where worth was measured in dollars, not deeds. I appreciate your concern, I said, my voice calm but edged with iron. But I'll be wearing the suit I own. Silence stretched across the line, taut as a wire. When Martin spoke again, his tone had hardened, the mask of civility slipping. Eldon, I'm trying to be diplomatic, but let me be clear. This wedding is important to me, my career, my reputation, my future. In-laws flying in from Connecticut. I cannot have Kristen's father looking like he shops at discount stores. The words were a blade, sharp and deliberate, meant to wound. I gripped the receiver tighter, my knuckles whitening, but my voice remained steady. It's a $100 suit, Martin. Quality craftsmanship. $100. His laugh was devoid of humor, a harsh bark that echoed through the phone. My cufflinks cost more than that. Look, I'm trying to help you, but there are limits to my patience. If you show up in that suit, you're not coming through those doors. Entry will be forbidden. The ultimatum landed with the force of a gavel, final and unyielding. In 30 years on the bench, I'd heard threats delivered with more subtlety and less venom from men who thought power, whether through money connections or fear, gave them the right to dictate terms. Martin's words weren't just a demand. They were a declaration of war, a challenge issued by someone who believed he held all the cards. I see, I said, my voice a low rumble, the calm before a storm. Thank you for clarifying your position. Good. I'm glad we understand each other. Martin's tone softened slightly, as if he thought he'd won. There's a men's warehouse on Wilshire. Opens at 10:00. We could meet there this afternoon if I hung up. The receiver settled into its cradle with a soft click, followed by a profound silence that filled the study. My law books stared down from their shelves, silent witnesses to the exchange. Outside, the neighbor's cat had vanished, leaving only swaying roses in its wake. My hand lingered on the phone, the cool plastic grounding me as Martin's words echoed in my mind. Entry will be forbidden. I stood slowly, joints protesting the sudden movement, and walked to the study window. The morning sun bathed Pasadena in golden light, neighbors walking dogs, children playing in yards, a world untouched by the drama unfolding in my life. But Martin's ultimatum had shifted something fundamental, like a case file opening to reveal unexpected evidence. This wasn't just about a suit or a wedding. It was about control, about a man who saw my daughter and me as pieces to be maneuvered on his chessboard. In my courtroom, I'd seen men like Martin before, defendants who wielded wealth like a weapon, who assumed their status insulated them from consequences. They spoke to victims with the same patronizing tone Martin had used, as if modest circumstances were a character flaw justifying any treatment. But there was something else in his voice, a tremor of desperation, as if he feared something I hadn't yet uncovered. Why was he so fixated on my appearance? Why the need to humiliate me, to exclude me from my daughter's wedding? I opened my notebook, the one I kept for cases that required extra scrutiny, and began jotting down details. Martin's exact words, the cadence of his voice, the way his apology had morphed into a threat. Evidence, I reminded myself, was built from such fragments. In my years on the bench, I'd learned to trust the quiet voice that whispered when something didn't add up. Martin Hargrove was hiding something, I was certain of it. I moved to my closet where the navy suit hung beside my judicial robes, its classic cut unmarred by time. I lifted it from the hanger, holding it to the light streaming through the window. The fabric was impeccable, the tailoring sharp, a testament to quality over cost. By any reasonable standard, it was perfect for a wedding. But Martin didn't operate by reasonable standards. His world was a labyrinth of hierarchies where wealth dictated worth and those who didn't conform were cast out. I hung the suit back in its place and closed the door, my mind racing. Martin's ultimatum wasn't just an insult. It was a miscalculation, a fatal flaw in a man who believed his money and connections made him untouchable. He'd assumed I'd either comply or slink away in shame, too intimidated to challenge him. He didn't know me. He didn't know the weight of 30 years spent weighing evidence, reading character, delivering justice. I returned to my study and sat in my recliner, the leather creaking under my weight. The notebook lay open on the desk, its pages a map of the case I was building, not in a courtroom but in my daughter's life. Kristen loved, Martin had chosen him despite his flaws, but love could blind even the sharpest minds. I'd seen it in court: spouses defending partners who'd betrayed them, clinging to hope until the truth became undeniable. I thought of Margaret, her patient amusement at human folly, her unerring instinct for character. She'd have seen through Martin in minutes, her sharp eyes catching the cracks in his polished facade. "What would you do?" I murmured to her photograph on the desk, her smile frozen in time. But I already knew. Margaret would have urged me to protect Kristen, not by confronting Martin directly, but by letting him reveal himself. Truth, she always said, had a way of rising from the shadows. The phone rang again, and I hesitated, half expecting Martin to call back with another attempt at manipulation. But it was Kristen, her voice bright but strained, as if she were forcing cheer through a veil of worry. "Dad, I just wanted to check in. Last night was a mess. I'm so sorry." "You don't need to apologize," I said, softening my tone. "You okay?" She sighed, the sound heavy with unspoken thoughts. "I'm fine. Martin's under a lot of pressure at work. He's not usually like that. I promise, once you get to know him." Her words trailed off, and I heard the doubt beneath them, the same doubt I'd seen in her eyes last night. "Kristen," I said gently, "did Martin mention anything about calling me this morning?" A pause too long to be innocent. "No," she said finally. "Why did he call you?" I considered telling her about the ultimatum, but something stopped me. Kristen was caught between two worlds, mine rooted in integrity and modesty, and Martin's glittering with ambition and control. If I revealed his threat now, she might defend him, her love clouding her judgment. Better to let the evidence build, to let Martin's actions speak louder than my warnings. "No," I lied, my voice calm. "Just curious. How are the wedding plans coming?" She launched into a flurry of details: floral arrangements, dress fittings, the guest list filled with names I didn't recognize, but could guess: tech moguls, venture capitalists, people Martin was desperate to impress. I listened, nodding along, but my mind was elsewhere, piecing together the puzzle of Martin Hargrove. Why the obsession with my suit? Why the need to assert dominance over me, a man he barely knew? It felt like more than arrogance, more than a clash of values. There was a purpose behind his cruelty, a shadow I couldn't yet see. As Kristen chatted, I glanced at the notebook, its pages filling with questions. Who was Martin really? What drove him to treat me as a threat, to demand my exclusion from the wedding? In court, I'd learned that motives often hid in plain sight, revealed through careless words or reckless actions. Martin's ultimatum was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of something darker beneath his charm. "Dad, you're coming to the wedding, right?" Kristen's voice pulled me back, a note of worry creeping in. It means everything to me. Of course, sweetheart. I said, my tone warm but resolute. I wouldn't miss it. We said our goodbyes, and I hung up the silence, returning like a tide. I stood and walked to the window, watching the roses sway in the breeze. The neighbor's cat had returned, its eyes glinting as it stalked something invisible in the grass. Nature's patience, I thought, was a lesson in timing. Predators didn't rush. They waited, watching until the moment was right. I was no predator, but I was a judge, and judges knew patience. 30 days until the wedding. 30 days for Martin to dig his own grave to reveal the full scope of his character. 30 days for me to uncover the truth behind his threats, to protect Kristen from a man whose mask was already slipping. I picked up my notebook and added another note: investigate Martin Hargrove. Motive unclear. The morning stretched on Pasadena, humming with its quiet rhythm. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that would break on Kristen's wedding day. Martin thought he'd won with his ultimatum, thought his wealth and status gave him control. He was wrong, and soon he'd learn just how wrong he was. The weeks following Martin's ultimatum passed like a slow drip of evidence in a complex case, each day adding a new piece to the puzzle of who he was and what he wanted. My Pasadena home became a sanctuary of routine, its modest walls shielding me from the glittering chaos of Beverly Hills. Every morning I rose at 6:00, brewed coffee in a pot older than Kristen, and sat in my study surrounded by law books that had guided me through 3 decades on the bench. The roses outside Margaret's legacy bloomed with stubborn resilience, their petals catching the dawn light like fragments of memory. But beneath the quiet rhythm of my days, a storm was brewing, its edges sharp with questions about Martin Hargrove. I hadn't told Kristen about the phone call, about the ultimatum that hung over me like a sentence waiting to be delivered. Her voice when she called was bright with bridal excitement. Details of dress fittings, floral arrangements, the guest list filled with names that carried the weight of wealth and influence. Yet there was a tremor in her tone, a shadow of doubt she couldn't quite hide. "Dad, you're still coming, right?" she'd ask, her words laced with a need for reassurance. "It wouldn't be the same without you." "Wouldn't miss it, sweetheart." I'd reply, my voice steady, a judge's calm, masking the calculations running through my mind. I didn't tell her about Martin's threat to bar me from the wedding, about his insistence that my $100 suit would disgrace his $200,000 spectacle. To tell her now would be to force a choice she wasn't ready to make, to risk pushing her closer to a man whose mask was slipping but hadn't yet fallen. Instead, I prepared. Not just for the wedding, but for the confrontation I knew was coming. In my study, I kept a notebook, its pages filling with observations about Martin. His words at the dinner, the cadence of his ultimatum, the flicker of unease in his voice when he thought he'd overstepped. 30 years on the bench had taught me that truth revealed itself in patterns, in the subtle tells of character, tightening jaws, hesitant pauses, eyes that darted when lies were spoken. Martin's behavior was a case file, and I was building the evidence piece by meticulous piece. Each morning I walked to my closet and inspected the navy suit hanging beside my judicial robes like a silent ally. The fabric was pristine, the tailoring sharp, a testament to quality over cost. I ran my fingers over the wool, feeling the weight of Martin's disdain in every stitch. To him it was a symbol of my inadequacy, a marker of a man who didn't belong in his world. To me it was a badge of integrity, a reminder that worth wasn't measured in dollars. I checked it daily, ensuring no wrinkle or stain could give Martin ammunition for his prejudice. It was evidence, material proof in a trial I hadn't yet named. But the suit was only part of my preparation. I began researching the Beverly, Wilshire, the wedding's venue, with the thoroughness I brought to every case. I studied floor plans downloaded from obscure corners of the internet, noting the ballroom's entrances, the placement of security stations, the flow of guest traffic. I found photographs of past events, galas, fundraisers, weddings, capturing the hotel's opulent interior, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes that seemed to absorb secrets. I memorized the layout the way a judge memorizes precedent, building a mental map of the terrain where this would unfold. I also researched the guest list. Kristen had shared a roster of tech entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and old money families from both coasts. Their names were unfamiliar, but their profiles pulled from business articles, and social media painted a picture of Martin's world, a glittering hierarchy where status was currency and appearances were law. I wondered how many of them knew about his ultimatum if he'd bragged about putting his future father-in-law in his place. Did they approve, or would they recoil if they saw the man behind the mask? The question lingered, a thread I tucked into my notebook for later. My days at the courthouse continued with the same precision that had defined my career. I arrived by 7:30, reviewed case files, listened to arguments, and delivered rulings with the measured calm that had become my trademark. Colleagues noticed nothing unusual, no hint of the personal trial unfolding outside the courtroom. But in quiet moments between hearings over lunch in my chambers, I found myself turning over Martin's words, searching for the motive behind his cruelty. Why the obsession with my suit? Why the need to exclude me? It felt personal, targeted, as if I represented a threat he couldn't articulate. One evening, as I sat in my study, the notebook opened before me, a memory surfaced, sharp, unbidden, like a witness taking the stand. Years ago, early in my career, I'd presided over a case involving a young executive, slick and confident, who'd defrauded investors to maintain his lavish lifestyle. His charm was a weapon, his arrogance a shield, but under cross-examination he'd crumbled, revealing a man driven by fear of being exposed as a fraud. Martin's behavior carried echoes of that case, a performance of control masking something fragile, something he was desperate to protect. I wrote in my notebook, "What is Martin hiding?" The question gnawed at me, a shadow that grew with each passing day. I began digging deeper, using skills honed from years of navigating legal databases and public records. Martin Hargrove, I learned, was a rising star in venture capital, a partner at a firm that funded tech startups across Silicon Valley. His LinkedIn profile was a polished narrative of success: Stanford MBA, a string of high-profile deals, a network of influential connections. But there were gaps, inconsistencies that caught my judicial eye. A brief mention of a failed startup in his early career, a sudden departure from a previous firm, whispers in industry blogs about creative accounting. Nothing concrete, nothing damning, but enough to make me wonder what lay beneath the surface. I considered hiring a private investigator, but that felt like crossing a line, a betrayal of Kristen's trust. Instead, I relied on my own resources, cross-referencing names from the guest list with Martin's professional history. One name stood out: Elena Vasquez, a prominent attorney who'd argued cases before my court for 15 years. She was on the guest list, a friend of Kristen's from her law school days. If anyone could shed light on Martin's world, it was her. I made a note to speak with her discreetly, perhaps at the wedding if the opportunity arose. Kristen called twice during those weeks, her voice a mix of excitement and exhaustion. "The florist keeps changing the arrangements," she said during one call, her laugh tinged with frustration. "And Martin's obsessing over the seating chart. He wants everything perfect." "Sounds like a lot of pressure," I said, probing gently. "Is he handling it okay?" A pause, brief but telling. "He's stressed," she admitted. "Work's been intense and he's worried about impressing his clients at the wedding. But he's trying, Dad. He really is." I heard the plea in her voice, the need to believe in the man she loved. But I also heard the doubt, the same doubt I'd seen in her eyes at the dinner. Martin hadn't told her about his ultimatum, I was sure of it. He was maintaining his image as the magnanimous fiancé, the man who'd sweep her into a life of luxury. The thought made my chest tighten, not with anger, but with a father's instinct to protect. Kristen deserved better than a man who saw her as a trophy, who saw her father as an obstacle to be removed. "Do you trust him?" I asked, my voice soft, careful. Another pause, longer this time. I think so," she said finally. "He loves me, Dad. I know he does." I didn't press further. Love was a powerful lens capable of distorting even the clearest evidence. I'd seen it in my courtroom spouses defending partners who'd betrayed them, clinging to hope until the truth became undeniable. Kristen wasn't there yet, but she was close, the cracks in her certainty widening with each interaction. As the wedding approached, I finalized my preparations with the precision of a trial lawyer building a case. I confirmed my RSVP, selected a gift, a silver locket that had belonged to Margaret engraved with Kristen's initials, and arranged transportation to the Beverly, Wilshire. But my real preparation was internal, a quiet fortification of resolve. Martin's ultimatum had been a declaration of war, and I was no stranger to battles of principle. I'd faced defendants who thought power granted them immunity, who believed they could bend the world to their will. They'd all learned in time that actions carried consequences. One night, 3 weeks before the wedding, I sat in my study, the invitation on my desk, its gold-embossed letters glinting under the lamp. Mr. and Mrs. James Hargrove, request the pleasure of your company. The formality felt like a mockery, a reminder of Martin's world where appearances trumped substance. I traced the letters with my finger, wondering about James Hargrove, Martin's father, a man I'd yet to meet. Was he the source of Martin's arrogance, or another victim of it? Another question for the notebook. I opened my closet and took out the suit, holding it to the light as I'd done every day since the phone call. It was more than clothing now. It was a symbol, a challenge, a piece of evidence in a trial that would unfold on Kristen's wedding day. I hung it back carefully, ensuring it was ready for the moment when Martin's assumptions would collide with reality. The evening before the wedding, I followed my routine with unusual precision. Dinner at 6 hours, grilled salmon and vegetables, simple and grounding. The news at 7 reporters, discussing local politics with the earnestness of a courtroom clerk, reading a docket. At 9:00, I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, the house settling around me with familiar creaks and sighs. I opened the closet and laid out my clothes for the morning: crisp white shirt, navy trousers, a tie knotted with judicial precision, and the suit jacket itself, the centerpiece of Martin's obsession. As I arranged the outfit, I felt a shift not unlike the moment before delivering a verdict. The suit wasn't just fabric. It was armor, a declaration of who I was and what I stood for. Martin saw it as a flaw, a marker of inferiority. I saw it as a truth, a reminder that character outweighed cost. I stood before my bedroom mirror, imagining the moment I'd walk into the Beverly, Wilshire, the suit announcing my presence, not as a clerk, but as a man who'd spent 30 years weighing justice. I thought of Margaret, her patient smile, her ability to see through facades with surgical precision. "You're building a case, aren't you?" I could almost hear her say, her voice warm with amusement. She'd always known when I was piecing together evidence, when my mind was working angles others couldn't see. This time the case was personal, the stakes higher than any I'd faced in a courtroom. I climbed into bed, the alarm clock ticking toward 10 hours. Outside Los Angeles pulsed with its restless energy, a city of dreamers and schemers chasing their desires under neon lights. Tomorrow, the Beverly, Wilshire would host a wedding, a celebration of love and commitment, or so it was meant to be. But beneath the surface, another story was unfolding, one of betrayal, revelation, and the quiet power of a man who'd learned to wait for truth to emerge from shadow. I closed my eyes, the weight of the past month settling over me like a familiar robe. Martin Hargrove thought he'd issued a verdict with his ultimatum, thought he'd banished me from his world. He didn't know the trial was just beginning, and I was a judge who'd never lost a case to arrogance. 30 days of preparation had led to this moment, and tomorrow the evidence would speak for itself. The morning of Kristen's wedding dawned with a stillness that felt like the hush before a verdict. I'd been awake since 5:30, lying in bed as the first rays of sunlight crept across the ceiling of my Pasadena bedroom, their golden edges sharp with promise. For 30 days I'd prepared for this moment, piecing together the case against Martin Hargrove with the patience of a judge awaiting evidence. His ultimatum, wear a better suit or be barred from the wedding, had been a declaration of war, a challenge rooted in arrogance and control. Today, in the gilded halls of the Beverly Wilshire, that challenge would be answered. I rose without fanfare, my movements deliberate as if preparing for a significant courtroom appearance. The shower ran hot steam curling around me as I shaved with the precision of a man who'd spent decades weighing justice. My reflection in the mirror showed a face etched with 65 years of experience, lines carved by countless testimonies, rulings, and the quiet grief of losing Margaret. Today, those lines felt like armor, a testament to a life built on principle, not pretense. Breakfast was simple toast and coffee consumed standing at the kitchen counter. Through the window, Pasadena unfolded in suburban tranquility, neighbors, walking dogs, sprinklers, misting lawns, a world untouched by the drama I was about to enter. I thought of Margaret's roses, their petals vibrant against the morning light, and felt her presence a quiet encouragement to protect our daughter, to let truth rise from the shadows. At 8 Azuras, I climbed the stairs to my bedroom and opened the closet. There it was, the navy wool suit, hanging like a silent witness to the past month's tension. Its classic cut was impeccable, the fabric unmarred, a $100 department store purchase that had become the centerpiece of Martin's obsession. I laid out the outfit with ritual care: crisp white shirt, navy trousers, a tie knotted with judicial precision, and the jacket itself a symbol of defiance against a man who measured worth in dollars. As I dressed, each piece settled over me like armor, transforming me not into a wedding guest, but a judge preparing to deliver justice. I stood before the mirror conducting a final inspection. The suit fit perfectly, its lines sharp, its color rich. I was no tech mogul, no venture capitalist, but I carried the quiet dignity of a man who'd spent 30 years upholding truth. In Martin's world, I was an anomaly, a modest figure who didn't belong. In mine, I was Eldon Mills, a man who'd never bowed to arrogance. I tucked Kristen's invitation into my jacket pocket, its gold-embossed cardstock heavy with promise. It was more than an invitation. It was my admission to a trial where the stakes were my daughter's future. I collected my keys and wallet, locked the house, and stepped into the morning air. My sedan started on the first turn, reliable as always, and I pulled onto the freeway, the road to Beverly Hills stretching before me like a path to judgment. The drive took 45 minutes. Los Angeles parting its traffic with an almost conspiratorial ease, as if the city itself sensed the weight of what was coming. The Beverly Wilshire rose ahead, its cream-colored facade gleaming like a monument to wealth and ambition. Valet attendants in pristine uniforms moved with choreographed precision, directing a parade of luxury vehicles, Bentleys, Teslas, a Rolls-Royce, that gleamed like liquid midnight. I surrendered my sedan to a young man who handled it with the same courtesy he'd shown the car before me. Money talked, but good service spoke universally. The hotel's lobby was a cathedral of opulence, marble floors, reflecting crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across the walls. Wedding guests moved through the space in elegant clusters, their voices a low hum of privilege, their attire a symphony of designer labels. I felt their eyes on me, not hostile but curious, as if my modest suit marked me as an outsider in their polished world. I carried myself with the calm of a man who'd faced scrutiny before. My steps measured my expression, unreadable. The ballroom doors stood open, revealing a vision of grandeur. White orchids cascading from gilded arches. Golden light spilling from chandeliers, a string quartet weaving chamber music into the air. The room was a stage. Every detail curated to impress the tech executives, venture capitalists, and old-money families Martin so desperately courted. I scanned the crowd, noting faces from Kristen's guest list, men in tailored tuxedos, women in gowns that shimmered like starlight, all part of Martin's carefully constructed theater. And then I saw her, Kristen, standing near the altar, a vision in ivory silk. Her wedding dress flowed around her like captured moonlight, transforming her into something luminous, almost otherworldly. For a moment my composure wavered, a surge of paternal pride mingling with the bittersweet ache of memory. She was Margaret's daughter, radiant and strong, but vulnerable in ways that made my heart clench. She turned, scanning the crowd, and her face lit up when she spotted me. Her smile a mirror of her mother's, warm, welcoming, innocent of the storm about to break. "Dad?" she called, moving toward me with practiced grace, her dress train gliding across the marble floor. "You look wonderful. That suit is perfect." "Perfect." I echoed the word, heavy with meaning she couldn't yet grasp. "You're breathtaking, sweetheart. Absolutely gorgeous." "Thank you for being here," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I know this isn't your kind of thing, all these people, the formality, but it means everything to me." Before I could respond, a voice cut through our reunion like a blade through silk. "Eldon." Martin approached his stride, confident, his tuxedo a masterpiece of tailoring that screamed wealth. His dark hair was slicked back, his eyes sharp with the certainty of a man on his own territory. But as his gaze fell on my suit, the navy wool, the $100 department store purchase, his expression shifted, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "I warned you about that suit," he said, his voice low-pitched to avoid Kristen's hearing. "Martin," I said calmly, "let's not spoil Kristen's day with unnecessary drama." "Unnecessary?" His face flushed, a vein pulsing at his temple. I made my position crystal clear. "We discussed this. You assured me you understood." Kristen looked between us, her brow furrowing with alarm. "What's going on, Martin? What are you talking about?" But Martin wasn't finished. His voice rose, drawing glances from nearby guests who sensed the brewing tension. "You didn't listen, Eldon. You ignored my explicit instructions about appropriate attire for this event." His eyes swept over me, his contempt undisguised. "Now there will be consequences." The word consequences hung in the air, a challenge issued before witnesses. Around us, conversations quieted, elegant faces turning to watch the drama unfolding near the altar. Kristen stepped forward, her voice sharp with confusion and embarrassment. "Martin, stop this right now." "What are you—" "Stay out of this, sweetheart." Martin snapped, his tone dismissive, as if she were a minor player in his script. "Your father and I have an understanding that needs to be clarified." I watched him, my judicial calm unshaken, but my instincts sharpened. Martin's behavior wasn't just arrogance. It was desperation, a performance driven by something deeper than wounded pride. His eyes darted across the ballroom, searching for something or someone to enforce his will. They settled on a tall man in a dark suit near the entrance, a figure whose understated elegance marked him as private security. Martin raised his hand, an imperious gesture that silenced the string quartet's melody. "Security," Martin's voice carried across the room, turning heads. "I need you to remove this man from the venue immediately." The man approached with professional purpose, his suit tailored but functional, a discreet earpiece glinting in the light. His name tag read, "Victor Reyes, Head of Security." The crowd parted, their fascination palpable, as if witnessing a play they hadn't paid to see. Kristen's face paled, her hands trembling as she clutched her dress. "Martin, you can't be serious." "This is my father. Your father should have listened when I explained the dress requirements," Martin said, his voice cold, authoritative. "I'm paying $200,000 for this wedding. I won't have it compromised by someone who refuses to meet basic standards." Victor's gaze moved from Martin to me, his eyes conducting a rapid assessment. My navy suit, my calm demeanor, the quiet dignity I carried like a shield. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that Martin didn't notice. "I'm sorry," Sir Victor said to Martin, his tone respectful but firm. "I cannot remove this gentleman from the premises." Martin blinked, his confidence faltering. "What do you mean you can't? I'm the client here. This is my wedding." "I understand," Sir Victor replied, his voice steady, "but this gentleman is a VIP guest. Hotel policy prohibits any action that might inconvenience someone of his standing." The word "standing" landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the crowd. Martin's bewilderment was almost comical, his mouth opening and closing as if Victor had spoken in tongues. VIP guest. What are you talking about? Look at him. His voice rose tinged with panic. He's wearing a $100 suit. He's some government clerk. What possible standing could he have? Victor's lips twitched, a hint of amusement breaking through his professional mask. Sir, I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics of our VIP arrangements, but I assure you Mr. Mills is welcome at any event in this hotel. His tone carried a subtle edge, a warning that Martin was treading dangerous ground. I recommend against further complications regarding his presence. Martin's face flushed crimson, his carefully curated authority crumbling in real time. The crowd watched, their fascination growing as tech executives and old money heirs leaned closer, sensing a shift in the social order. This is ridiculous, Martin snapped, jabbing a finger at Victor. I don't care about your policy. I'm paying for this event. The hotel appreciates your business, sir. Victor set his stance, shifting to one of quiet readiness. But certain guests receive accommodations that supersede individual event arrangements. I suggest we allow the ceremony to proceed. Who is he? Martin demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. What aren't you telling me? The question hung in the air unanswered as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Martin's composure unraveled his polished facade, giving way to raw fury. This is completely unacceptable, he shouted, his face a dangerous shade of red. I'm the paying customer. You work for me today. Victor's expression hardened, his professional calm giving way to something sterner. Actually, sir, I work for the hotel and our policy is clear about guests who become disruptive. He stepped closer, his presence commanding. I'm going to need you to step outside and calm down. Step outside. Martin's voice rose to a near-hysterical pitch. This is my wedding. I paid $200,000 for this venue. You can't. Victor moved with fluid precision, catching Martin's arm in a practiced hold and twisting it behind his back with professional efficiency. Let's go, sir, he said, guiding Martin toward the ballroom's garden doors. The crowd parted like a tide, their faces a mix of embarrassment and fascination, as if watching a king fall from his throne. Let go of me! Martin struggled his tuxedo, rumpling his hair, falling into disarray. This is assault. I'll have your job. I'll sue this entire hotel chain. I know exactly who you are, sir, Victor said, his voice neutral but firm, applying just enough pressure to keep Martin moving. You're someone who needs to leave this venue immediately. The garden doors loomed ahead, opening to a courtyard of manicured hedges and elegant fountains. Martin's shouts echoed, drawing more guests outside, their curiosity magnetic. This isn't over, he screamed, his voice raw with impotent rage. I'll sue every one of you. The hotel, the security company, everyone. Kristen followed, her ivory dress trailing across the marble tears streaming down her face as she tried to process the wreckage of her wedding day. The crowd formed a loose semicircle in the courtyard, their murmurs a backdrop to Martin's unraveling. You have no idea what kind of legal trouble you're in, he bellowed, spittle flying as Victor held him firmly by the arm. I'll own this place when my lawyers are done. Victor scanned the crowd, his eyes alert. Sir, if you continue making threats, I'll have to call the police. Call them. Martin roared, his coordination faltering from rage and pre-ceremony champagne. Call everyone. When they find out you've assaulted a paying customer, violated my rights, you'll all be finished. I stood near the fountain, my suit pristine, my expression calm. The scene unfolding before me was a courtroom in miniature, Martin the defendant, exposing his true nature before a jury of his peers. The guests watched, their fascination tinged with horror, as the man who'd promised elegance delivered chaos. Kristen's tears glistened in the sunlight, her dream of a perfect day shattered by the man she'd promised to marry. Martin's gaze locked onto me, his eyes wild with desperation. This is because of you, he screamed, pointing a trembling finger. You and your ridiculous $100 suit. You think you can ruin my day? I'll make sure you... His words were cut off by a new voice, clear and commanding, slicing through the chaos like a gavel. Let's see you try suing the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. The crowd fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Elena Vasquez stepped forward, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her presence radiating the authority of someone who'd commanded courtrooms for decades. Her tailored gown shimmered, but it was her eyes, sharp, unyielding, that held the crowd captive. Martin's mouth opened, then closed, his tirade stalling, as if someone had cut his strings. "Chief Justice," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Elena's smile was a blade, precise and unrelenting. "Judge Eldon Mills, Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, the highest judicial officer in the state." She gestured toward me, her respect palpable. "I've had the honor of arguing cases before his court for 15 years. The color drained from Martin's face, his eyes darting between Elena and me, his mind struggling to reconcile the man in the $100 suit with the title he'd just heard. The crowd's silence deepened, their fascination giving way to awe. Victor released Martin's arm, stepping back as the fight drained from his captive. Martin swayed, his tuxedo wrinkled, his carefully crafted image lying in ruins. "Eldon," he stammered, turning to me, his voice desperate. "Your Honor, I mean, forgive me. I didn't know. I never wouldn't have what I asked." My voice quiet but cutting. "Insulted my appearance. Threatened to bar me from my daughter's wedding. Demanded I prove my worth through expensive clothing." Each question landed like a blow, Martin flinching as if struck. His mouth worked, searching for words to undo a month of arrogance. "I was wrong," he whispered. "Completely wrong. Please, Your Honor. I'll do anything to make this right. The suit, it looks fine. Perfect even." The crowd watched, their attention rapt, as Martin's desperation filled the courtyard. Tech moguls who'd come to network old money heirs who'd expected elegance now witnessed a masterclass in accountability. I stepped forward, my gaze steady, judicial. "The suit was never the issue, Martin. Character matters more than clothing. Respect matters more than wealth." "Yes, absolutely," he said, nodding frantically, his voice trembling with the need to salvage something, anything from this disaster. "You're right. I understand now. Please, how can I fix this?" I looked at Kristen, her face pale, tears staining her cheeks as she stood frozen in her ivory dress. The weight of her pain hit me harder than Martin's insults ever could. "You can start by apologizing to Kristen," I said, my voice low but firm. "She's the one whose wedding you've disrupted. She's the one who deserves your remorse." Martin turned to her, his expression crumbling. "Kristen, I'm so sorry," he began, his voice breaking. "I never meant for—" But Kristen's eyes told a different story. They were no longer the eyes of a hopeful bride, but of a woman seeing her fiancé's true nature for the first time. The damage ran deeper than a disrupted ceremony. It was a fracture in the foundation of her trust. She didn't respond, her silence louder than any words. I stepped closer to the fountain, the crowd's attention shifting to me. I took a breath, feeling the weight of 30 years on the bench, the countless times I'd spoken truth in the face of hubris. "Friends," I began, my voice carrying the calm authority of a courtroom. "Today we've witnessed something important, a lesson in how we judge others and how those judgments reveal who we are." The crowd leaned in, sensing the gravity of the moment. Elena's eyes met mine, a nod of respect passing between us. "For 30 years I've sat in judgment of human behavior," I continued. "I've seen how people act under pressure, how they treat those they consider beneath them, how they wield power when they think no one is watching. Today my future son-in-law made the mistake of judging me by the price of my clothing, not the content of my character." Kristen stepped closer, her tears slowing, a flicker of pride breaking through her distress. The crowd was silent, hanging on my words. "The true measure of a person isn't their bank account or their wardrobe," I said. "It's how they treat the waiter, the driver, the family member they think holds no power. Character is revealed not in triumph but in moments of pressure, when we encounter those we mistakenly believe to be our inferiors." Martin stood alone by the fountain, his earlier bravado gone, his face ashen as my words stripped him bare before his peers. The applause began slowly, led by Elena and a few legal professionals who understood the weight of what they'd witnessed. It grew tech executives and heiresses joining in, recognizing wisdom when they heard it. I turned to Kristen, her dress rustling as she reached for my hand. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You handled this perfectly." I squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of her trust, her love, her pain. Around us, the crowd began to disperse, their conversations animated with the day's events. Some approached to introduce themselves, offering handshakes and words of admiration. Martin remained by the fountain, isolated, his reputation in tatters among the very people he'd sought to impress. Justice, I reflected, had a way of asserting itself even outside the courtroom. The $100 suit had proven its worth not through price tags, but through the principles it defended. The wedding could continue, but it would do so with a new understanding of who held true power in that elegant courtyard. Martin Hargrove had thought he could control the narrative, but he'd forgotten one truth in the court of character: the verdict always finds the guilty. The courtyard of the Beverly Wilshire shimmered under the late afternoon sun, its fountains casting prisms of light across the manicured hedges, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Martin Hargrove stood alone by the water's edge. His tuxedo rumpled his face, a mask of desperation, as the crowd's murmurs swirled around him. Moments ago, Elena Vasquez had dropped a bombshell, her voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision. Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. The words hung in the air like a verdict, reshaping the narrative of the day, turning Martin's public tantrum into a self-inflicted wound. I stood near the fountain, my $100 Navy suit pristine, my expression calm but unyielding, a judge in a courtroom of my own making. The crowd's silence was profound, a collective intake of breath as they processed Elena's revelation. Tech moguls in tailored suits, heiresses in shimmering gowns, and legal professionals who recognized my name turned their eyes to me, their fascination tinged with awe. Kristen, still radiant in her ivory wedding dress, stood frozen, her tear-streaked face a canvas of shock and dawning pride. Martin's earlier shouts, his threats to sue, his insistence that I didn't belong, now echoed like the ravings of a defendant who'd misjudged the court. Chief Justice Martin whispered again, his voice barely audible, his eyes darting between Elena and me, as if searching for a loophole in reality. His polished facade, so carefully constructed, lay in tatters, his reputation unraveling before the very audience he'd sought to impress. Elena stepped closer, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her presence commanding the courtyard like a seasoned litigator addressing a jury. "That's right, Martin," she said, her tone steady but laced with steel. "Judge Eldon Mills has presided over California's highest court for a decade, delivering rulings that shape the state's legal landscape. I've argued cases before him for 15 years, and I can assure you his integrity is unmatched." The crowd's murmurs grew, a ripple of recognition, spreading through the guests. A few legal professionals nodded, their faces lit with respect, while others, venture capitalists and socialites, whispered my name, piecing together fragments of news articles and courtroom anecdotes. I felt their gazes shift, no longer seeing a man in a modest suit, but a figure of authority, a guardian of justice who'd walked among them unnoticed. Martin's face drained of color, his mouth working soundlessly as he struggled to process the reversal. I didn't know," he stammered, turning to me, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Your Honor, I swear if I'd known who you were, I never wouldn't have." What I interrupted, my voice quiet but sharp, cutting through his excuses like a gavel through noise. "Insulted my suit, demanded I change to fit your standards, threatened to bar me from my own daughter's wedding." Each question was a measured strike, exposing the flaws in his character as clearly as any courtroom cross-examination. Martin flinched, his shoulders hunching as if my words were physical blows. "I was wrong," he said, his voice trembling with desperation. "Completely wrong. Please, Your Honor, I didn't mean to offend you. The suit? It's fine. It's perfect. I was out of line. The crowd watched, their silence heavy with judgment. Martin's apologies, frantic and hollow, were the pleas of a man who'd realized too late that he'd miscalculated his opponent. I'd seen this before in my courtroom defendants, who scrambled to undo their actions when the consequences became clear, their remorse born not of sincerity, but of fear. I stepped forward, my navy suit catching the light, its simplicity a stark contrast to Martin's disheveled extravagance. "The suit was never the issue, Martin," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority of 30 years on the bench. "You judged me by the price of my clothing, not the content of my character. You assumed my worth based on appearances, not actions. And in doing so, you revealed who you are." Kristen moved closer, her dress rustling softly, her eyes glistening with a mix of pain and pride. I glanced at her, my heart aching at the sight of her tear-streaked face, her dream of a perfect wedding shattered by the man she'd chosen. "You owe your apology to Kristen," I said, my tone firm but gentle. "She's the one whose day you've disrupted, whose trust you've betrayed with your arrogance." Martin turned to her, his expression crumbling under the weight of his own actions. "Kristen, I'm so sorry," he began, his voice cracking. "I never meant for this to happen. I was trying to protect our image, to make this day perfect for you. Please, you have to understand." But Kristen's eyes told a different story. They were no longer the eyes of a hopeful bride blind to her fiancé's flaws, but of a woman seeing him clearly for the first time. Her silence was louder than any rebuke a verdict delivered in the stillness between them. She clutched her bouquet, the orchids trembling in her hands, and turned away. Her shoulders squared with a strength I recognized, Margaret's strength tempered by love and loss. The crowd's attention shifted to me, their eyes expectant, sensing that this moment demanded more than a confrontation. It demanded a reckoning. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 30 years of judicial wisdom, the countless times I'd spoken truth in the face of hubris. This was no courtroom, but it was a stage, and the lesson I was about to deliver would resonate beyond these gilded walls. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady, projecting across the courtyard with the clarity of a closing argument. "Today we've gathered to celebrate love and commitment, but we've also witnessed something else, a lesson in how we judge others and how those judgments reveal our own character." The crowd leaned in their faces, a mix of curiosity and respect. Elena stood nearby, her nod of encouragement, a silent acknowledgement of the moment's gravity. "For 30 years I've sat on the bench weighing evidence, hearing testimony, and rendering judgments," I continued. "I've seen every shade of human behavior, courage, greed, humility, arrogance. And I've learned one truth above all: the way we treat those we perceive as powerless reveals who we are when no one is watching." Martin stood alone, his head bowed, the weight of my words pinning him in place. The guests listened, their earlier fascination giving way to reflection. "Martin Hargrove made a choice today," I said. "He chose to judge me not by my actions, but by the price of my clothing. He assumed my modest suit, marked me as lesser, someone who could be dismissed or controlled. But he was wrong." I paused, letting the words settle, feeling the crowd's attention like a current running through the courtyard. "Character is not measured by wealth or status," I said. "It's measured by respect, by kindness, by the ability to see beyond appearances to the truth beneath." Martin's actions today weren't just an insult to me, they were a betrayal of the values this day was meant to celebrate. Kristen's eyes met mine, a flicker of pride breaking through her pain. The crowd began to applaud, the sound starting softly with Elena and a few legal professionals, then growing as tech executives, heiresses, and even Martin's own colleagues joined in. It wasn't just approval, it was recognition, a collective acknowledgement of a truth too often buried under the weight of wealth and ambition. I turned to Martin, who stood frozen, his face ashen, his earlier bravado replaced by the stark realization of his isolation. "You have a choice now, Martin," I said, my voice softer but no less firm. "You can learn from this, rebuild what you've broken, or you can continue down a path where pride outweighs principle. That choice is yours, but know this, actions have consequences, and today you've felt their weight." Martin said nothing. His eyes fixed on the ground, his shoulders slumped under the burden of his own making. The crowd's applause faded, replaced by a hum of conversation as guests began to process the day's events. Some approached me offering handshakes and words of admiration. Lawyers who'd argued before my court, business leaders who'd read about my rulings, even a few of Martin's colleagues who seemed embarrassed by association. "Judge Mills," said a woman in a sapphire gown, her voice warm with respect, "your words were profound. I've never seen anything like this at a wedding." "Thank you," I replied, my tone gracious but reserved. "Sometimes the truth finds its moment." Elena approached, her smile a mix of amusement and admiration. "You've always had a way of commanding a room, Eldon," she said. "I almost feel sorry for him." "Almost." I chuckled softly, the tensions easing for the first time that day. "Justice doesn't always need a courtroom, Elena. Sometimes it just needs the right moment." Kristen stepped closer, her dress catching the fading sunlight, her face a complex tapestry of emotions, grief, pride, and a quiet resolve that reminded me so much of Margaret. "Dad?" she said, her voice trembling but strong. I had no idea. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" I took her hands, feeling the warmth of her fingers, the weight of her trust. "I wanted you to know me as your father." "Not a title," I said. "Titles don't define us, actions do. And I've always believed you'd see the truth for yourself." Her eyes glistened, but she smiled, a fragile but genuine expression that broke my heart and mended it in the same breath. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "And I'm so sorry for what Martin did." "You don't need to apologize," I said, squeezing her hands. "This day is yours, Kristen. Let's make it about love, not conflict." She nodded, her gaze drifting to Martin, who stood alone by the fountain, his colleagues avoiding him as if he carried a contagion. The weight of her disappointment was palpable, a silent question hanging between us. What would she do now with a fiancé whose true nature had been laid bare, the wedding coordinator? A brisk woman in a black suit approached her, clipboard clutched like a lifeline. "Ms. Mills, Judge Mills, we're ready to proceed with the ceremony if you'd like," she said, her voice professional but tinged with sympathy. "The guests are returning to the ballroom and the officiant is prepared." Kristen hesitated, her eyes flicking to Martin, then back to me. "Give me a moment," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. She walked toward Martin, her dress trailing across the cobblestones, a vision of grace in a moment of chaos. I watched from a distance, my judicial instincts tempered by a father's hope. Their conversation was private, their words lost to the hum of the fountains, but I saw the set of Kristen's shoulders, the way she held herself with newfound strength. Martin's gestures were desperate pleading, but her expression remained resolute, her decision forming in the space between them. Elena stood beside me, her presence a quiet anchor. "She's stronger than she knows," she said, her voice low. "Like her father. Like her mother." I corrected my thoughts, drifting to Margaret. Her wisdom, her ability to see through facades. Kristen had inherited that gift, and today it was guiding her through a moment that would define her future. As Kristen returned, her face was calm, her eyes clear despite the tears that lingered. "Dad," she said, taking my arm, "let's go inside. The ceremony's about to start." I nodded, offering her a smile that carried 30 years of love and protection. "Lead the way, sweetheart." We walked back to the ballroom, the crowd parting to let us pass, their respect palpable. The string quartet resumed their music, softer now, a gentle underscore to the day's transformation. Martin followed. At a distance, his presence diminished a shadow of the man who'd entered the day with such confidence. As we reached the altar, I felt the weight of the moment settle over me. Not as a judge, but as a father. A man who'd watched his daughter grow from a curious child to a woman capable of facing hard truths. The officiant, an older man with kind eyes, began the ceremony, his words a reminder of love's endurance even in the face of betrayal. But my mind lingered on the courtyard, on the moment when justice had asserted itself not through force, but through truth. Martin's downfall wasn't my doing. It was the inevitable result of his own choices, his arrogance laid bare before those he'd sought to impress. I'd spent 30 days preparing for this building, a case not with legal briefs, but with patience, letting his actions speak louder than my warnings. The ceremony continued, Kristen's voice steady as she recited her vows, her gaze focused on the future rather than the man who'd nearly derailed it. I stood beside her, my navy suit a quiet testament to principle over pride, my heart swelling with pride for the woman she'd become. As the officiant pronounced them man and wife, the crowd applauded their enthusiasm, tempered by the day's events. Martin stood at the edge of the gathering, his expression a mix of shame and resignation, his place in Kristen's world uncertain. I caught Elena's eye, her nod, a silent acknowledgement of the justice we'd witnessed. A justice not of punishment, but of revelation of truth rising from the shadows to claim its moment. The reception began, the ballroom filling with laughter and music, but the air carried a new clarity, a recognition that character, not wealth, defined the day. I danced with Kristen, her smile brighter now, her strength shining through the cracks of her broken expectations. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered as we moved across the floor. "For everything. You're welcome, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Always." The night stretched on Los Angeles, glittering beyond the ballroom's windows, a city of dreams and deceptions where truth could still find its way. Martin's downfall was a lesson not just for him, but for everyone who'd witnessed it, a reminder that power without principle was a hollow thing, destined to crumble under its own weight. The Beverly Wilshire ballroom glowed with a golden warmth. As the reception unfolded, the clink of champagne flutes and the murmur of laughter filling the air like a melody of renewal. The string quartet played softly, their notes weaving through the crowd, a gentle counterpoint to the storm that had broken in the courtyard hours earlier. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, my navy suit still pristine, its $100 price tag a silent testament to the day's lessons. The weight of the afternoon's events lingered not as a burden, but as a quiet triumph, a reminder that truth, like water, always finds its way to the surface. Kristen moved through the room, her ivory dress catching the light like a beacon, her smile brighter now, unshackled from the shadow of Martin's betrayal. She danced with friends, laughed with guests, and carried herself with a grace that reminded me of Margaret, resilient, radiant, unbreakable. I watched her, my heart swelling with a father's pride tempered by the ache of knowing how close she'd come to tying her life to a man whose character crumbled under scrutiny. Martin remained on the periphery, a diminished figure in his rumpled tuxedo, his earlier bravado replaced by a hollow silence. The guests avoided him, their polite smiles masking the judgment that had settled over the room. His colleagues, the tech moguls and venture capitalists he'd so desperately sought to impress, now spoke in hushed tones, their glances sharp with reassessment. Martin's downfall wasn't my doing. It was the inevitable consequence of his own choices, a verdict delivered not in a courtroom but in the court of human character. I stepped onto the balcony, needing a moment to breathe, to let the day's events settle. The Los Angeles skyline stretched before me, a glittering tapestry of ambition and dreams, its lights pulsing like a heartbeat. The air was cool, scented with jasmine from the hotel's gardens, and I closed my eyes, letting the quiet wrap around me like a familiar robe. In 30 years on the bench, I'd learned that justice didn't always require a gavel. Sometimes it unfolded naturally, a slow unveiling of truth that needed no force to prevail. My thoughts drifted to my notebook, tucked away in my Pasadena study, its pages filled with observations about Martin, his insults, his ultimatum, the cracks in his polished facade. I'd spent a month building a case, not with legal briefs, but with patience, letting his actions speak louder than my warnings. The evidence had been clear: his arrogance, his need for control, his assumption that wealth granted him power over others. In the courtyard, that evidence had been presented, and the jury, Kristen, the guests, even Martin himself, had rendered their verdict. A soft rustle broke my reverie and I turned to see Kristen stepping onto the balcony, her dress shimmering in the twilight. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I needed to find you." I smiled, opening my arms, and she stepped into them, her warmth grounding me, as it had since she was a child. "You're the star of this show, sweetheart," I said. "Shouldn't you be dancing?" She laughed, a sound tinged with both relief and resolve. "I needed a break, and I needed to thank you. For today, for everything." "You don't need to thank me," I said, brushing a stray curl from her face. "I'm your father. It's my job to be here." Her eyes glistened, but her smile held firm. "You're more than that, Dad. You're a force. I had no idea who you really were, not until today." "Why didn't you tell me?" I chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Titles don't matter, Kristen. I wanted you to know me as the man who raised you, not the one who wears a robe. Besides, I've always believed people reveal themselves in time. Today, Martin did just that." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the skyline, her expression a mix of sorrow and clarity. "I saw him, Dad. Really saw him. The way he treated you. The way he tried to control everything. I don't know what happens next, but I know I can't ignore it." Her words carried a weight. I recognized the dawning realization of a truth too long obscured. I'd seen it in courtrooms, in the faces of those confronting hard realities for the first time. "You don't have to decide tonight," I said gently. "Take your time. Trust yourself. You're stronger than you know." She squeezed my hand, her touch a silent promise. "Like Mom was," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And like you are." We stood in silence, the city's lights reflecting in her eyes, a mirror of the future she was beginning to shape. The question of her marriage, of Martin's place in her life, hung unspoken, a thread left dangling for another day. But I felt a quiet certainty that she'd find her way, guided by the same instincts that had carried Margaret and me through our own trials. Back inside, the reception continued, the music swelling as guests filled the dance floor. I caught sight of Elena Vasquez, her silver hair glinting as she raised a glass in my direction, a silent toast to justice served. Victor Reyes, the security chief, stood near the entrance, his professional demeanor softened by a nod of respect. The ballroom was alive with celebration, but beneath it ran a current of change, a recognition that today had been more than a wedding, it had been a reckoning. I returned to the dance floor, Kristen at my side, and we joined the guests, moving to the rhythm of a world made new. The navy suit, my $100 badge of honor, felt lighter now, its purpose fulfilled. It had been a symbol not of wealth, but of principle, a reminder that character outweighs cost, that integrity endures when arrogance falls. As the night drew to a close, I stepped outside once more, the city's pulse slowing with the hour. Los Angeles stretched before me, a canvas of light and shadow, a place where dreams collided with truth. Justice had been served today, not through punishment, but through revelation, a quiet victory that left the world a little brighter. I thought of Margaret, her roses blooming back in Pasadena, their petals carrying her memory. "We did okay, didn't we?" I murmured, my voice lost to the night. The answer was in Kristen's smile, in the applause of strangers, in the suit that had stood firm against a man who'd mistaken price for power. The wedding was over, but the story wasn't. Kristen would face choices, hard ones, but she'd face them with the strength she'd inherited, the strength I'd seen today. And I would be there as always, a father, a judge, a man who believed that truth given time always prevailed.